can see why those science fiction games call alien species races. You can see why, because they are. It's like Star Trek. They are just spins on humans, right? That's what they're for. Whereas here is the example where they're saying, no, that's not what the trolls are for. The trolls are if you can really play it in human. Interestingly enough, the elves and the dwarves never managed to get there. The Dragonutes did and the trolls did. But the elves and the dwarves always remained very opaque to player options and frankly to the game in general. I mean, every version kind of grapples with how are we going to present these elves and pretty much fails, in my opinion. But the trolls and the Dragonutes sort of evolved into a form where people thought playing those would be a lot of fun, without ever becoming human. So I don't know. That's the only. I'm trying to think of other examples where you are playing, where you have multiple options of this kind, and they are different. I mean, these are different. Apocrypha, the one I mentioned, goes that way, but the whole point is not to sort of. I don't know if I'm overstating this, but if you pick up 5th edition D&D, yeah, we all get to play different things, but we're making the A team, and everybody knows the A team gets along.
Right.
Whereas some of these other ones, that's not necessarily the case. In my opinion, if you played a troll in any of the Gloranthan games, you're setting up for some values clash. You're setting up for times when somebody really isn't going to get along. I don't know, but maybe. What are your thoughts on some of those? Anybody? Thoughts on playing character races in which the point, if that's the right word, is more about the difference than about the team up?
That's a good observation because I still have that Star Frontiers document open, and I do remember sort of playing this as a teenager, and it was always very, the different races, like the Dralicites have their, odd spore-based reproduction, and the Frusk have their, insect-like, egg-laying reproduction. But in terms of what you actually do in the game, usually people are like, we're on the mission, and right. He's the philosophical one, and he's the hardworking, practical one.
Right.
Like that's literally.
Yeah, well, it's your elves and dwarves kind of all over again in a lot of ways.
So there's the question of like even in a product where like the genuine root biological diversity idea is there, it's sort of just like that's wallpaper, and
right. Right.
The minor personality characterization is the real content for that game. It's sort of weird.
I am interested in it when it is tagged with the biology, if you will, though, because I mean there are lots of games where you have 100 options, but they're all different human cultures, which is fine and not that different from what we're talking about. But I am interested in it at the moment when, for better or for worse, or I mean, never logically, never mind that part, but for better or for worse, they are sort of, and regardless of the term, they are tagged as different species-ish. Who here knows much about Talislanta?
I know, but I do remember the old Dragon magazine ads. No elves.
I was about to mention this, yes. And Herman, yeah, you've got that one. I've got the early '90s version, which was by Jonathan Tweet, and that one's by the original authors, I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. The interesting thing, does it have that huge range of player character, little tiny pictures? Because for those who don't know, Talislanta has something like 50 races to choose from.
This one has pages, and it's not very not too accessible from.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I see. Yeah. I'll pull up. Right. The version I have has little paragraphs and then a picture, and all the pictures are the same physical size. So a given page has like 5 of them down the row or down the column, and that's so it's you go page after page after page, and you're saying, wow, that is a whole lot of options. Um, and they're mostly different colored people, like purple, or whatever, frost white skin with blue hair and stuff like that. Not all of them. Some of them are pretty freaky. One guy has 2 brains, and so his head is all bulbous and stuff like that. And some of them are short and pixie-like or something like that. Some of them are a little bestial. But the point is that there's tons. And they do some effort. They put some effort into how you play any one of these options. There's sort of the hope that you're going to play this not just as a different way to have different numbers, but you're going to play this as an outlook. Now, all of the games do that to some extent. I mean, D&D has always tried to do that a little bit. Dwarves are like this, or the Dragonborn are like that, or stuff like that. But but this one kind of really shoots for they're different. Now, the joke about Talislanta, which I'm sure I'm not the first to make, is there's no elves because they're all elves. The artists, for whatever reason, perhaps by direction, gave everybody pointy ears. Everyone has Spock ears. And so, and the idea is that you do kind of get the idea that they're all sort of, ice elves, forest elves, desert elves, city elves, sort of the impression that you get. So maybe that's sort of, I don't know how relevant that is. But one thing that always struck me about them, some of them really looked like interesting cultures. Others come off as somebody's favorite player character who they decided to turn into like a race option. Does that make any sense, Herman? That's
that's a bit what I remember from it. It's been ages since I properly read through it, but.
Yeah. And again, I'm thinking of a fairly derived form, a new author and a new publishing effort from the original. But and I'm not really trying to make fun of it, but it's an interesting example. Everybody is very humanoid, or almost everybody is very humanoid, and everybody's a very sort of non-earthly appearance, and everybody has a gimmick. And at that point, I mean, this is where I start sounding crotchety and like I'll never like anything. I mean, what's wrong with that? I don't know if anything's wrong with it, but I will say that it does start to take on kind of a blur across them all. That you kind of get the idea that there's, the how am I going to put it? The diversity doesn't mean anything. It doesn't invoke anything. It's just colorful.
Right.
And
I was going to say it's just color at that point.
Right. And so it's kind of, and if that's the case, then does that kind of mean that all player characters are, in terms that we might think of as relevant, all the player characters are one race? I mean, in the loaded meaning of the term race, right? So with everything, I mean, it's kind of like a bunch of hats. So that's, again, I mean, maybe that's certainly better than having a whole bunch of racist caricatures from one to another. I get that, but it's definitely another bog to walk into. Let's think of a game with a broad range of these options, maybe much broader than your elf dwarf equivalents too. Can you think of any more games that have that? These big, long.
Legendary Lives,
Certainly, yeah, that we've
which actually has ethnicities and
right. That's the interesting thing, that the human diversity is just tagged as the same level of character option as the non-human types. So really, if you collapse that, so you put all the humans together, then you're still looking at about a dozen, right? Roughly 10 or 12, I think.
Yeah, and some of them are like there is an insect
Right.
race.
Some of them are pretty wacky. Right.
So some are pretty distinctive and distinctively not human, right? That you would play. And when we played, I mean, we it would have been interesting. It would be interesting, I think, to play Legendary Lies where one or more of the players was taking on one of those characters. Because, Ron, when you were talking about RuneQuest and playing trolls, I mean, I think one of the challenges you have at the table then is, okay, if somebody is a troll and the other players are humans, right? I mean, that kind of creates a kind of, if I were the GM, I would be a little worried about like exactly how is this all going to work out, right?
Well, I'm a different kind of GM. I wouldn't be worried. I'm like, ooh, car crash, but but I agree. I mean, that particular thing is there. Well, that can be an interesting thing in Legendary Lives because a lot of the non-human groups are very much tagged in terms of class. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the diversity in options among the characters is about a lot more about class and center of culture than it is species. There's that's the relationship to the Elven Empire, basically, and who everybody is in relationship to that in terms of income, status, jobs, expectations, the way your religion relates to the Elvish religion. It's a much more, we've talked about this, it's a much more sophisticated setting than it looks in precisely those terms. I've always wanted to play a game of Hobbs, Rattlings, and Goblins.
Right.
For just that reason. Not because they're non-human, but because they're perceived as, the scum of the earth. They're perceived as laborers at best and, untrustworthy little bastards by everybody. And so that's an interesting point. One of the things that I find in role-playing games is you can have all this so-called racial diversity with no class diversity to speak of. And I don't mean character class. I mean like real-world class. And then you can have games where that appears in a sort of subtle way. We have yet to see the role-playing game that actually has, 1% affluent bourgeois, middle class, working class, and lumpen proletariat, right? We have yet to see the role-playing game that actually gives you options with different stats for each of those.
Not with different stats, but frequently you do see that, like in Dragon Quest, you see that used to explain how much money you have, basically.
Right.
To start with.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you do have your social classes and villagers and stuff, but it is kind of interesting that it's nowhere near the impact of, race and character class.
Yeah. Right. This reminds me of something.
Yeah, unless you take it to extremes like paranoia, and where the everyone, of course, is a human, but everyone starts as a red creature, a red person from the infrared masses, and tries to rise up to be an ultraviolet, which is the 1% of the 1% of the 1%.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the very few, explicit class. But on the other hand, as you say, you don't start with diversity so that Marx style class conflict is baked into the game.
Nope. No.
Right. That's kind of interesting. How come no role-playing game has that?
Yeah. because they're all American.